I'm going to transition now to talk a little bit more about some of the livestock issues that are impacting you. Bruce was a great lead-in because he addressed some issues that there's a lot. We've been talking about how much crossover there is between, right now when you're dealing with these drought-stressed crops and trying to figure out what to do with them and the different issues that impact with the livestock. I'm going to move this mic over here. There, it won't keep hitting that. As Rosie said in the beginning, I'm based in the Sioux Falls office and as the Extension Cow-Calf Specialist. This is kind of a similar chart to what Dennis showed you, but this one focuses on the cattle areas. And so inside the red line is where we are having the drought areas, and if you look at the dark green here are the major livestock areas. So about 73% of our cow herd right now is in an area that is experiencing drought, and there's about 28% of that cow herd is in an area that's in the top 2 levels of drought. So as he mentioned, we had the extensive drought down in Texas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico, and we were really worried about that a year ago because of the number of cows that are down in that region. And now we are seeing a wider, more encompassing drought, and we're facing about 57% of our pasture land is rated as poor or very poor, and of course that's where the base of our cows are at this time. And just for example, in looking at, I seen a number just the other day about Nebraska and how they got 1.9 million head of cattle in Nebraska, and a year ago the pasture was rated 4% poor or very poor, and this year it's rated 72% poor to very poor. So just a dramatic increase or dramatic decrease in the moisture level from one year to next. And talking here in South Dakota, about 85% of our area where we have our cattle and our hay is one of the different drought levels. And of course, you start focusing on them top levels, then you still are also looking at about a third of our cows in that region. So as a producer told me the other day, he said the biggest difference in the drought is I can't go 200-300 miles or to a neighboring state where I know they have green lush grass and work out a deal to have them pasture my cows or buy some hay from them. With such an extensive drought like this that we are looking at, it's definitely causing the issues that we need to talk about today. So I've talked a little bit about the first couple points here on the screen, but as we know, when we get to these situations, decisions need to be made about what to do with our cattle numbers. USDA reports that actually our cow slaughter numbers aren't drastically higher than they have been from last year's induced drought, but USDA's numbers lag 2 weeks from the time the report gets out. So when we think about what's happened just in the region in the last couple of weeks, so when they look at some different daily estimates, we're talking about 12% up on our cow and bull slaughter, and just the overall impact of what that's going to possibly have to our cow herd. As I go on in the presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about water quality issues because that's definitely become an issue for you as livestock producers. And obviously, Bruce talked about it a little bit with the feed issues, but really looking at the high price feeds and what impact that is having. Just since the drought really set in and when we started to know that that's what we were headed for, from June on, CattleFax reports that has added $159 to just feeding out a steer. And at the same time that's been happening, because of the concern and the high input costs, we've seen the price of feeder cattle fall about $168 a head for a 550-pound calf. So a lot of different things, and as we look at the price of corn and the cost to gain impacts, you talk about $5 corn and then look at $7, $8 corn, that can nearly double the cost to gain impacts that we have there. So obviously major challenges as we continue to go forward on making decisions about feeds and feed supply. Difficult to find cheap feeds, and if we are looking at more of a cheap feed or a residue type feed, we are dealing with feed that's probably lower quality and have to look at some supplemental options. The concern about nitrates that we have in feed, and then also just all of the other factors. Bruce mentioned them a little bit, you know, the costs that go into putting up these feed stuffs if you're not used to putting up those feed stuffs or don't have the equipment, or if you got to buy hay, the transportation costs to get the hay in there. And also definitely looking, you know, causing us to look at a lot of considering a lot of alternative feed stuffs, and that we may need to move in and use into the livestock herd this year. I won't spend as much time on this because we did have the opportunity to focus on this a little more in the previous presentation, but you know, in the decision of looking at these drought stress crops and the corn and the beans and the hay issue that was mentioned about the fact of the nitrate level in the hay, you know, definitely these are the concern that we need to look at with feeds, and obviously from the discussion today, most of you are very aware of that, and that's a point that we're glad that you're aware of. When the previous speaker talked about the nitrate testing and the different reports that come back, this is one of the charts, and we have a handout in the back of the room that has this chart and a really good article explaining nitrate levels in feeds. But so this one is the one that's reported on nitrate nitrogen on a dry matter basis. And what I did is I put in the red the parts per million, because that tends to be a little bit more how we refer to it. So as you see, if you send your feed in for nitrate testing, or you're testing a corn sample, as you get up in the parts per million, you start getting above 1,500, you really got to start and look at some options about mixing in some less high risk feeds into the ration. And as you continue to go up, as you get closer to that 4,000 parts per million, obviously high risk to feeding it to pregnant animals, and needing to mix it again with other low risk feeds, and then getting up into toxic levels. So this, as I said, is just one of those 3 different methods that sometimes the labs can report it back to you. And the article in the back of the room just focuses on this report. It tends to be the one that's seen a little bit more common and the values more commonly used. So I just wanted to briefly also talk about that. Obviously, as I mentioned, when you're looking at alternative feedstuffs and when we're looking at drought stress crops, you know, not only do we not know the nitrate level in the crops, but we are also looking at some different nutrient profiles than maybe what we are used to. So there is, it encourages you to take samples and do some nutrient testing, and so that you can get an idea of what really is the value. You're also going to be mixing together feeds that you maybe haven't used before, and so take the time to visit with, if you have a nutritionist you're working with, or your feed co-op store, or contact us at the extension, because we have a number of nutritionists on staff that can run different rations for you and try different options, so that you can kind of still meet the standard levels that you're trying to meet. But as I said, things have got a little more complicated. Another thing in managing hay resources with the price of hay that hay has got, we certainly want to make sure that we're managing it the most effectively as possible. Purdue University's done some studies about limit feeding by only feeding, putting the hay out for periods of time of 4 or 6 or 8 hours, doing different types of limit feeding, and they're not seeing any reduction in the weight gain on the cows, and seeing way less waste. And so that, along with the studies I've seen in regards to, you know, putting your bales of hay, instead of just putting them out in the field, not in a rack, or unrolling them, So much more waste when it comes to that than when they're in a bale rack. And when you're talking about a lot more high quality or high dollar feed, it's important to think about different ways to reduce the amount of waste that you might have. Also wanted to bring to your attention that there is a number of feed resource websites for those of you who have access to the internet. If you don't have access to the internet, you can contact us at the Extension office. We can input this information for you or help gather this information for you. But North Dakota State has a good feed list resource where you can find buyers and sellers of feed, and they do sort it by state. So you can go in and you can put in South Dakota, and up will come everybody in South Dakota that has feed or hay for sale, and you can look at that. Or if you happen to have any silage or something extra this year that you haven't typically had, it is a good listing, and it's one that we're cooperating with them to provide for South Dakota producers. There's also a national hay exchange, and Nebraska, for those Nebraska people here tonight, there's a Nebraska hay hotline run through their Department of Agriculture, and it is also, as you know, with the extent of the drought and the widespread extent of the drought, we're not just looking down the road for hay, we're looking across many areas to get the feed. And on our iGrow website, we also have our crowd map. Also just want to talk about water quality issues, and just with the extreme heat that we've had this summer, lack of rain, and lack of wind too through the summer, which some of us might not complain about some days, but the top picture here is a blue-green LJ in a water pond, and I ran across a producer just yesterday who owns cattle with another producer, and was telling me that they lost 4 cows, walked out recently to their cattle pasture, and laying dead beside the pond was 4 cows from blue-green algae. So what it is it builds up, and when the water gets stagnant, the hot, dry, calm days will cause the algae to breed and to grow, and it kind of puts this almost looks like green paint kind of on the water, like you spilt paint in the water. It's really hard to actually see the actual particles, but there's definitely important to take steps to monitor your water ponds, your stock ponds, and be watching out for this, because with the blue-green algae, it's basically toxic. Cows that ingest it will pretty much toxic right away on the impact that it will have. Also in South Dakota, sometimes we have concerns about high sulfates in water, and there is a fact sheet in the back of the room about water testing for sulfates. We can test in the extension offices. You can bring your water in, and we can do a quick test immediately to let you know. And again, we've had some people bring water in from stock ponds and stuff, and it's just amazing the difference between, their whole operation. And 5 or 6 different stock ponds, we've had water come in that's below 1,000 parts per million, and a few miles down the road they have a different pond that's over 3,000 or 4,000 parts per million. So just really important to think about the water issues and how important that is also during a drought issue. Just want to wrap up by talking about additional management issues that impact you if you are a beef producer. One of the important things to think about is maintaining the body condition score of your cattle, especially your cows going into the winter months. A good target is a body condition score of a 5. Unfortunately, in a drought situation, we got feed that, as I said, is a little lower in nutrient value. The cattle are maybe slightly undernourished, and so it gives a chance to start pulling down on that body condition score, but important to kind of keep it to go into the winter for carrying that calf through the winter and reproduction back again in the spring. Also, some of you have maybe made the decision about early weaning, to early wean your calves. I don't have time to go into a lot of details today about the options of early weaning, but certainly an option to consider to help save your pastures. Taking that calf off the cow makes a huge difference in the amount of nutrients pulled out of that pasture for that cow to keep lactating for that calf. But there's also issues to consider if you do not have the facilities to manage early weaned calves or the labor, and a number of issues that way. So if you have some more questions about early weaning, or we also have some really good articles on igrow.org about making the decision on early weaning. And also with low feed resources, it maybe is a time to look at some of your lower, less productive cows in your operation if it works out for you to move them out of your operation so that you're not putting that extra feed into them. And if you do make a decision to do early weaning and don't have access to the don't have access to be able to feed right there in your operation, you don't have the facilities. I just recently wrote an article about helping to find a backgrounder or selecting a feedlot that can help you feed out lightweight calves, and what questions and decisions that go into making that and working with a feedlot, because it may be a relationship that is something new and that you haven't had to deal with as much in the past. Just quickly show you, this was a SDSU study about early weaning. As of course the weaning happened a little bit later, but it was trying to mimic a dry situation, a drought situation, and showing that by taking the calves off the cows earlier, what the large impact that had in getting those cows rebred back the next spring, so and their conception rate. So just one example of something that you can look at with that. So to keep us moving here, that's kind of the overview of some of the livestock issues. A number of the fact sheets in the back of the room also deal with livestock related issues, and I can take any questions now, or I can turn it over to Tim. He is going to talk a lot more about the crop aspects that Bruce talked about, as well as the livestock issues, but really start putting some economic numbers to the decisions that you are faced with today.